What's up? We're back for the third installment of Part 1, otherwise known as 1C. I would like to point out before we start how amazingly shiny my head looks due to the lighting in my new kitchen. It's ungodly bright, and I mean, look at the beautiful shine off this bad boy. But we left off talking about all the structures of a neuron, and keep in mind that a neuron is just the cell of the nervous system. It's an individual portion of a bundle of neurons which completes a nerve, but what we have here is kind of a demonstration of the function of a neuron and all of its parts. So if we just kind of go over this real quick, you'll notice that a neuron consists of the dendrites, which receive the signal from some source. Some dendrites, which we'll get into in a little bit, actually receive the stimulus or detect the stimulus, which travels through the soma or cell body, which contains the nucleus, and then there's typically a widened section that comes through the soma or cell body, which connects to the axon and runs down into the axon. That widened section here is the axon hillock, runs into the axon. The axon turns into axon branches, which eventually turn into axon terminals, synaptic bulbs, or synaptic terminals. There's also an insulating sheath around that called the myelin sheath. In between each myelin are what are called the nodes of Ranvier, and myelin is actually generated by Schwann cells. So what we're going to get into now is actually how to classify neurons based on their structure, how they appear. There are a couple different classifications, and it's solely usually based on where the nucleus is going to be located. But one of the first kinds is called an anaxonic neuron. These are small neurons, have no myelin or anatomical clues that allow you to be able to distinguish the axons from the dendrites. Essentially, what they look like, in my opinion, are stars. You really can't tell the difference between the axons and the dendrites. The nucleus is large, centrally located, and you'll notice the axons themselves are relatively short. Also, you'll notice that there are no myelin sheaths or insulation here, which leads us to believe that a lot of anaxonic neurons are actually located within the central nervous system because, keep in mind, most of the neurons within the central nervous system do not have myelin sheaths. Then you also have what are called bipolar, bi referring to two. This is where the neurons have one dendrite and one axon, and the cell body is located between them. They're relatively rare, but they play a super important role in relaying information concerning sight, smell, and hearing, which leads me to tell you guys that bipolar neurons are most likely associated with cranial nerves. Those are the ones that run straight from the brain out that don't relay through the spinal cord. But if you'll notice, these are also special senses. Sight, smell, and hearing are the three that we rely on for survival. They are unmyelinated. If you'll notice, single dendrites, single axon, and the soma or cell body is perfectly located in between those two things. Then you have what is called unipolar, meaning one pole. These are also called pseudo-unipolar. You're not going to see that term often. You're going to see them unipolar, meaning the dendrite and the axon processes are continuous with each other, and the cell body or soma lies off to the side. What it looks like is a continual highway, and this is just a little secondary offshoot, but this is the soma or cell body. Their axons may be myelinated, they may not be myelinated, but you're going to typically see sensory neurons of the peripheral nervous system that are usually going to be bipolar. So that leads us to believe that a majority of them are going to be myelinated since they are part of the peripheral nervous system. Then you have multipolar neurons. These are the ones that have several dendrites and a single axon. These are probably the most common in the central nervous system, but also they're relatively common in the peripheral nervous system. All motor neurons that control skeletal muscle are also multipolar neurons. This is what allows skeletal muscle tissue to have that fine motor control. Here's what they typically look like, and these are also going to be the ones that you're going to stereotypically see in diagrams of neurons that are labeled with all the parts. So you will have, keeping in mind multipolar, meaning you have the soma or cell body, the dendrites surrounding the soma or cell body, and then that soma or cell body extends down into an axon, and the axon actually ends up branching off into two separate branches, and then you end up with multiple terminal buttons and everything like that. So if you pictured this connecting to a muscle cell, what you'll end up seeing is all of these individual synaptic terminals or axon terminals here and here and here, would actually end up synapsing with individual muscle fibers. That's what allows such fine motor control. Just a quick review here. Anaxonic, meaning you really can't tell where the dendrites and the axons are. You have the bipolar, soma or cell body located directly in the middle between the dendrites and the axon. You have a unipolar, where the soma or cell body is off to the side. You have a continuous stream of dendrite to axon. And then you have the multipolar, with multiple dendrites surrounding the soma or cell body, which extends on an axon hillock, very long axon, and multiple synaptic terminals. Just another picture here. The one that is missing here is the anaxonic. So we just went over the structural classification. Now let's go on to neuron classification based on how they function. This is when we start getting into really and truly feedback loops, reflex arcs, all of these things. But what we have are a couple classifications. The first one I talk about is sensory neurons. These are also called the afferent neurons because they're part of the afferent peripheral nervous system. What they do is they detect changes in the environment. Basically, they pick up stimuli, and they send that stimuli to the central nervous system. So these can be stimuli in the internal environment, which end up being visceral sensory neurons, or the external environment, which end up being somatic sensory neurons. Regardless, your body has to maintain homeostasis by balancing the inside and the outside environments. Sensory neurons possess the receptors, which are called exteroreceptors. There's proprioceptors, and then there's interoreceptors, which we discussed earlier. Let's review this. Exteroreceptors detect stimuli in the external environment. Proprioreceptors detect position of your joints and your muscles. And then interoreceptors monitor internal conditions of your body, usually visceral organs, things like carbon dioxide levels, oxygen levels, pH levels, things like that. Example here, sensory neurons that detect heat, light touch, pain, cold, and the movement of hair follicles, because right here, these are actually neurons that attach to the bottom of a hair follicle. You have corpuscles, and here's the actual nerve. You'll notice that all of these things, even though they serve a different function, end up coming down here and connecting to a single nerve, which will eventually run in. These are exteroreceptors. These would be proprioreceptors, monitoring, not proprioreceptors, I apologize, interoreceptors, which are going to monitor the position and movement and conditions, of the internal organs. And then again, here are proprioreceptors, which monitor the position of your body. The second classification based on function are motor neurons. Motor neurons are also called efferent neurons because they carry signals out of the central nervous system to structures in the body, usually to exhibit responses. Motor neurons are connected to voluntary skeletal muscles. There's also the involuntary responses, such as those that are connected to the cardiac muscle, smooth muscle of your intestines, and your blood vessels and things like that, or glands, to control the automatic responses within your body. Motor neurons and sensory neurons are two main sections of feedback loops and reflex arc, which we're actually going to get into later. But motor neurons, these are the ones that are most likely going to be associated with voluntary movement of your skeletal muscle. So when we talked about how an action potential goes from the very, very end of a neuron into muscle, which we did last semester, you'll notice that all of those ends of the synaptic terminals where neuromuscular junction comes into play, those were all the very ends of motor neurons. And then we have what are called interneurons. These are associated only with the central nervous system. They're only going to be located there. They are essentially the connection between sensory neurons and motor neurons within the brain or spinal cord. So they're responsible for that integration and distribution of sensory information once it reaches into your brain or spinal cord. The more complex the response that is needed in a given situation, the greater number of interneurons are required. Think about stepping on a tack or a nail or something like that with your foot. While that information is sent through sensory neurons to your central nervous system, then your central nervous system sends a signal back out through your motor neurons, but those interoneurons, since you have to lift your foot, balance, there's coordination, there's staying standing, all of those things happen, there's more and more interneurons of the central nervous system involved. And you'll also notice that these tend to look like axonic neurons. Two examples. Sensory neurons, again, keep in mind, these take information from the environment and send it to the central nervous system. So if I had the ability to actually draw right in this region here a brain or spinal cord, the sensory neurons would carry that information into the brain or spinal cord. Then the motor neurons would carry that information out of the central nervous system to effectors for a response. So we just finished going over one of the two types of cells that are within the nervous system. Those were all the neurons. Now we're going to get into the neuroglia and our neuroglial cells or glial cells. These are the support cells of the nervous system. So if you look at this picture right here, you'll notice this bad boy right here, this blue section here, is going to be the soma or cell body. This is going to be the axon, and then there's these dendrites here. Same thing in this section right here. But you'll also notice that there's these red cells here, this star-shaped cell here, this fuzzy, hairy-looking cell here, and this one here that actually connects between two different axons. Those are going to be called neuroglial cells, or the support cells of neurons. So neurons are the ones that are primarily responsible for sending information through the nervous system. They are the hardcore functioning ones, and the neuroglial cells are just going to be the ones that are there for support. What are their functions? Well, they regulate the environmental conditions around the neurons. They make sure that any small damage that can be repaired is done. So some of them function for repair, some of them function for insulation, some of them function for protection, which we'll get into there. They provide a framework or support framework for the neural tissue. They act as phagocytes, which, if you remember, phagocytic cells are typically those that are involved with defense. They engulf microorganisms, swallow them up, digest them, and make sure that they are removed from the area. Because some microorganisms can be pathogens or even things that are going to be harmful to the body. They tend to be much smaller than neurons, much smaller in size, but also much smaller in length. Neurons are extremely long, large cells. But they actually outnumber neurons because they're there for the support of the neurons. They're found both in the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system, but there's a larger variety within the central nervous system. And if you think about that, the central nervous system is where integration and processing of information occurs. Therefore, they're going to need a larger amount of support because that's a really higher order functioning item within the central nervous system, or I'm sorry, within the nervous system. These type of neural cells actually have the ability to regenerate, where actual neurons themselves, they do not. This is why when somebody severs their spinal cord or becomes injured, that they actually are paralyzed based on where that is severed, because of the fact that neural tissue does not have the ability to regenerate and grow back and repair extreme damage. There's a couple different types of glial cells. You have ependymal astrocytes, oligodendrites. You have microglial cells, all found within the central nervous system, but one of the big ones I want to talk about are satellite and Schwann cells of the peripheral nervous system, because what they create is the myelin sheaths that support and insulate and protect. So here is a list of all the various types of glial cells, and I'll be really honest with you in terms of what you need to know for this class. Those cells, it's not a hardcore thing that I'm going to be testing you on, but it is things to know, worth knowing, that they do play a significant function within the nervous system. So let's talk about Schwann cells. Satellite and Schwann cells, particularly in the peripheral nervous system, they enclose all the axons of the peripheral nervous system with the neurolemma, which, remember, is the cell membrane of neurons. And what they do is they're responsible for producing the myelin of peripheral axons and for repairing neurons whenever possible. So if you look at the axon here, there's a very, very small purple section here, which is amplified or magnified right here. What it does is it produces, that Schwann cell nucleus produces all of this myelin and neurolemmal sheath that actually surrounds the axon. And that's where we're going to stop. So that's the end of the third part. Please let me know if you have any questions. Good night.